I didn't mean to walk in on him. Really, I didn't. It was supposed to be just another one of those lazy summer afternoons at Kian's house. The ones where we'd spend hours on the couch, flicking through video games, talking nonsense, and occasionally raiding the fridge for snacks. An afternoon that was as familiar as it was comfortable. But the moment I opened that door, my life shifted in ways I wasn't ready for. There, standing in the middle of the living room, was Dorian, Kian's dad. He wasn't the man I'd expected to see. Instead of his usual calm, composed self, he was standing there with a towel slung low around his hips, droplets of water glistening on his sculpted chest. His dark hair was still wet, hanging in loose strands around his face. And his eyes, they locked with mine. Time froze. I had walked in expecting to find Kian. Instead, I found his father. And not just any version of him. No, this was a different Dorian. A Dorian whose raw presence, powerful build, and intensity left me frozen in place, staring. For a moment, all I could do was blink. He hadn't moved, just stared back, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't read. He was completely unfazed, even amused, as if my presence in the doorway was the least surprising thing in the world. "Enjoying the view, Kale?" he asked, his voice deep, smooth, laced with something that made my stomach tighten. The words hit me like a jolt of electricity, and I could feel my face burning. My heart hammered against my ribs. What was I supposed to do now? I'd never once thought of Dorian like this. Not in this way. Not in a way that made my thoughts spiral out of control. My mouth opened and closed, but no coherent words came out. I could feel my entire body heat up in embarrassment. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. I wasn't supposed to be caught like this. Not by him. I turned abruptly, my feet carrying me back down the hall before I even realized what I was doing. I didn't stop until I was safely in Kian's room, shutting the door behind me with a soft thud, as if somehow that would shield me from the surge of emotions suddenly crashing over me. There I stood, pressed against the wall, breathing heavily. My hands shook, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. It felt like my brain was screaming at me to make sense of it all, but I couldn't. How could I explain why my chest felt tight, my skin flushed, and my thoughts tangled? That night, I lay in bed wide awake. The usual sounds of the house, the hum of the fan, the distant murmurs of the evening, felt foreign now. The image of Dorian standing there unashamed, smirking at me wouldn't leave. It replayed in my mind over and over. And with each replay, something inside me stirred, something I couldn't quite name. I had never thought of Dorian in that way before. Sure, he was handsome, everyone knew that, but he was also off limits. He was my best friend's dad. And yet, now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked by something unspoken, something that had shifted between us. Was it a joke? Was it just harmless teasing? Or had there been something deeper in his gaze, something that told me he knew exactly what he was doing? I turned over in bed, pulling the covers tighter around me, but it didn't help. The thoughts kept coming. The image of Dorian's eyes, the smoothness of his voice, the way he looked at me with that strange, knowing smile. It made my pulse quicken even now, hours later. And worse, much worse, I couldn't stop thinking about how I'd felt when our gazes met. That heat, that electric tension. What the hell was wrong with me? I rolled over onto my back, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The questions burned through my mind like wildfire. What did it mean? What did I even want it to mean? I didn't know how to make sense of it. But one thing was certain, the world had changed. And I was left standing at the edge of something I wasn't ready for. The next day, I was at Kian's again. Kian had gone out to run errands, leaving me alone with Dorian. The house felt eerily quiet without him, and it didn't take long for my curiosity, no, my need to understand what had happened earlier, to get the better of me. I tried to bury it, to convince myself that I was overthinking things, but the image of Dorian's smirk, that low, teasing voice, lingered in my mind. I wasn't sure what I expected to find when I ventured into the house alone, but when I wandered toward the garage, I found Dorian in his usual element. Lifting weights, the garage door slightly opened to let in a faint breeze. His muscles flexed under the strain of the barbell, his focus intense. The sight of him, powerful and confident, was hard to ignore. As I lingered by the door, unsure of whether I should just turn and leave, Dorian glanced up. His eyes locked onto mine with that same unshakable intensity from earlier, a silent invitation in his gaze. "You just going to watch, or do you want to join?" His voice was smooth but edged with something playful, something that made my heart race unexpectedly. I hesitated. My hands fidgeted nervously at my sides. This was a different situation than before, but it felt like the same game, one that I wasn't sure I wanted to play. But curiosity, or something else, something more dangerous, pulled me in. "I don't know," I muttered, feeling foolish. My gaze shifted to the weights in his hands and back to his face. "I've never really lifted before." He smirked again, his expression softening in a way that was both reassuring and unsettling. "You're stronger than you think, Kale," he said, his voice low and almost intimate, as though we were the only two people in the world at that moment. He handed me a barbell. As I wrapped my hands around it, I felt the weight of it in my arms, the strain already starting to show. I wasn't used to this. But before I could adjust my stance, Dorian was there, right behind me. His presence was overwhelming. I could feel the warmth of his body just inches from mine as he leaned in to adjust my grip. The sensation of his fingers brushing mine sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I swallowed, trying to ignore the way my pulse began to hammer in my ears. "Just a little tighter here," he murmured, his breath warm against the back of my neck. I could feel the heat of his body, the subtle pressure of his closeness. His hands lingered longer than necessary, his touch firm but gentle, guiding me as if this moment was just another training session. But it felt different, more intimate, more dangerous. I fought to steady my breath, unsure of what to do with the conflicting emotions rising inside me. I could feel my body responding, betraying my attempts to remain unaffected. I focused on the barbell in my hands, trying to block out the way his closeness seemed to consume the space between us. "You're doing great," Dorian said, his voice still low and steady. "You've got this." I nodded, my throat dry. I wasn't sure what I expected, but it wasn't this feeling of something unspoken between us, something heavy that hung in the air. As I struggled with the weight, Dorian's presence seemed to anchor me in a way that both soothed and unsettled me. He didn't back away. If anything, he leaned in even closer, his gaze not leaving me for a second. The distance between us, once so familiar and safe, now felt like an abyss I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. My mind screamed at me to step back, to break the connection before it became something I couldn't control. But my body felt frozen, caught in the heat of the moment. His words echoed in my head, "You're stronger than you think." But it wasn't just the weights. It was the way his voice seemed to wrap around me, the way his hands had lingered on mine. Everything felt charged, as though we were teetering on the edge of something neither of us could name. I wasn't sure if I could trust myself anymore. There were too many questions swirling in my mind, questions about what this meant, about what Dorian saw in me, about what I wanted, or maybe more accurately, what I feared I wanted. "Take a break," he said softly, his hands finally pulling away from mine. It was a gentle command, not quite an order, but it still felt like one. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving me. "I'll grab you some water." I stood there for a moment, still holding the barbell, as if that small weight could anchor me in a reality that no longer felt like my own. As he walked away, I felt a strange emptiness settle in the space where his presence had been. The silence in the garage was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unraveling, something I had no control over. But I couldn't stop it. I didn't know how. It happened so fast, I barely had time to process it. Kian had gone to bed early after a long day, leaving me alone in the living room. The house felt quieter than usual, the hum of the television the only sound breaking the silence. I tried to keep my mind busy, zoning out to the show, trying not to think about what had happened earlier. About Dorian. About the way his presence seemed to haunt me even when he wasn't around. But then, like an unpredictable wave, he walked in, his muscular frame visible in the low light, his movements purposeful but unhurried. He held a bottle of beer in one hand, his other hand casually brushing through his hair, as if he hadn't just walked into the room with a presence that commanded attention. "You're up late," he said, his voice casual, almost teasing, as he sat down beside me on the couch. I looked at him briefly, then quickly averted my gaze, focusing back on the TV. "Yeah, not tired," I mumbled, my words betraying me in a way I wasn't ready for. My heart was racing, and I could feel the heat creeping up my neck. I didn't want him to notice how off I was, how much his presence affected me. But of course he noticed. Dorian always noticed everything. He didn't say anything at first, but after a pause, his eyes, intense and sharp, locked onto mine. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice soft but firm. It wasn't an accusation, but something about the way he said it made me feel exposed, like I was somehow caught in something I wasn't prepared for. I wanted to deny it, to shrug it off, but the words stuck in my throat. I shifted uncomfortably, trying to find something to say that would make it all go away. But instead, the words I hadn't meant to speak slipped out, as if they were waiting for the right moment. "I don't know how to act around you." There was a long, still moment before his lips curved into a slow smile. It was soft at first, almost amused, but then it deepened, turning almost predatory in a way that sent a chill through me. "Maybe you're overthinking it," he said, his tone still light then. He leaned a little closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I froze, the tension between us growing thicker by the second. The space that had once felt comfortable now felt too close, too charged with something I couldn't name. The air around us felt thick, suffocating. And then, without thinking, without any warning, his hand brushed against mine. It wasn't a slip of the hand. It wasn't by accident. His fingers lingered just long enough to send my heart into overdrive, my breath hitching in my throat. The warmth of his skin, the firmness of his touch, left a trail of heat on my palm. For a split second, I thought about pulling my hand away, but something stopped me. Something held me in place. I could feel his gaze on me, felt the weight of his attention like a heavy, irresistible force. And I knew in that instant that things were changing, that something was shifting between us, like a thread slowly unraveling, pulling us both into unknown territory. But I couldn't let this happen. Not like this. I took a deep breath, pulling my hand back, but the distance between us now felt like a void. My mind was spinning, caught between what I knew was right and what I couldn't ignore. "Kale," Dorian said softly, his voice suddenly serious, almost knowing. "You don't have to pretend with me." I couldn't answer. I couldn't do anything except sit there, the silence between us stretching taut like a tightrope, each of us standing on the edge of something we didn't fully understand. But I could feel it, the pull, the connection, something far more complicated than I was ready for. Dorian leaned back, his eyes still locked on mine, his lips curving in a knowing smile that made my heart race all over again. And I realized, with a sickening clarity, that I didn't want to look away. I didn't want to pretend. I didn't want to stop. But I had to. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my body vibrating with the tension I didn't know how to escape. I think I should go to bed," I muttered, unable to look him in the eye. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, my heart pounding as I left the room. As I made my way to the hallway, I could still feel the weight of his presence, even though he was behind me. I didn't know what this was, or what had just happened between us, but I knew that it couldn't continue. Not like this. And yet, deep down, I couldn't ignore the pull. The temptation. The dangerous allure of what was left unsaid. I had no idea how far we had already gone, or how far we were willing to go. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. That night, I couldn't sleep. It had been 2 days since that night in the living room, and the weight of what happened between Dorian and me sat heavily on my chest. Every moment of that brief exchange played on a loop in my mind. The heat of his touch, the look in his eyes that left me breathless, the way he made me feel like the world had stopped spinning. But then the guilt would crash over me, drowning me in a sea of confusion. This was my best friend's father. This was wrong. And yet, I couldn't push him out of my thoughts. It was like something inside of me had woken up, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, that something refused to stay silent. So when I found myself staying up late again the next night, I knew something had changed. Something had snapped. I was in the kitchen, making myself a cup of tea, trying to keep my mind busy. The silence in the house felt oppressive. The only sound was the soft clink of the mug against the counter. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired and needed sleep. But the truth was, I was waiting for him. I was waiting for Dorian. And then he appeared. His presence filled the room before I even saw him. Tall, commanding, yet somehow still casual in his movements as he leaned against the doorway. His eyes were fixed on me, But there was no amusement this time, no teasing smile. Just intensity. He was serious. And I could tell he had been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. "Kale," he said softly, his voice lower than usual, and my heart skipped a beat. "We need to talk." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth was dry, and I could feel the pulse in my throat. The tension that had been building between us since that night was now thick. I knew we had crossed a line, but what I didn't know was if there was any going back. He took a step closer, his movements smooth, and my breath caught. The space between us was shrinking, and I felt trapped, caught between what I wanted and what I knew was wrong. His hand brushed against my cheek, and I felt the heat of his touch like an electric shock. My body tensed at the contact, but I didn't pull away. His fingers lingered on my skin, sending shivers down my spine. "You can stop me," he murmured, his lips hovering dangerously close to mine. His breath was warm, his words thick with meaning. "Just say the word." But I didn't say a word. I didn't stop him. The tension snapped. Before I knew it, his lips were on mine, warm and insistent. I was drowning in the sensation, lost in the way his body pressed against mine, the way his hands seemed to know exactly where to touch, where to hold. Every part of me screamed that this was wrong, that we shouldn't be doing this, but it was like I couldn't breathe without him. It was overwhelming. I kissed him back. I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to. We moved together like something natural, something inevitable. And before I could even process what was happening, we were on the couch. The house was quiet, the soft sounds of the night the only thing that surrounded us. Everyone else was asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing between us. He carried me up and placed me on the kitchen counter, kissing my lips, my neck, my chest, and using his hand to feel every part of my body. But the guilt still lingered, twisting in my gut. I knew I wanted this. I could feel his tool begging to be let out. My tool had also increased inside my inner shorts and was becoming so impatient, but still, I kept telling myself that I couldn't keep doing this. That it wasn't right. But every time I tried to pull away, his touch pulled me back, stronger, more insistent. And so we continued, as if everything else in the world had ceased to exist. When it was over, and the house was still, I lay beside him, the weight of what we had done sinking in. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, and yet I couldn't bring myself to regret it. I couldn't bring myself to say the words that I knew I needed to say. But I knew deep down that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And whatever came next, there was no going back. The days following that night were terrible for me. I woke up each morning, the sunlight harsh against my eyelids, only to be consumed by a wave of guilt the second my mind cleared. I couldn't shake the image of Kian's face, his bright smile, his laughter, the way he looked at me as if I were his closest friend. But now, every time I looked at him, my chest tightened and my stomach twisted in knots. It felt like a betrayal I couldn't undo. It wasn't that I didn't care about Kian. I loved him in the purest, most untainted way. We'd known each other for years. He was the one person I could always count on. And yet here I was, trapped in a situation that made me question my own morals. And then there was Dorian. Always calm, always in control, like he had no second thoughts. "We're both adults, Kale," he had said when I confronted him about that night, his voice calm and firm. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." It should have made me feel better, like he understood. But the words only made the turmoil inside me worse. Because I did owe an explanation. To Kian. To myself. And I wasn't sure I had the courage to give it. That night, after everything, I lay in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the chaos in my head. Dorian's touch and lips still lingered on my skin, and I couldn't deny that I had wanted it. The way he looked at me, the way he made me feel, like I was the center of his world. I hadn't felt that way in a long time. And yet, every time I let myself think of him, I heard Kian's voice in my head, saw his face, and the guilt would come crashing down again. I was torn between two worlds. One where I could keep pretending everything was normal, keep going through the motions with Kian, and one where I could give in to the pull I felt for Dorian, the dangerous, forbidden pull that seemed to have taken root inside me. But what if I lost everything? What if the cost of choosing Dorian, of allowing this to continue, was more than I was willing to pay? I couldn't ignore the consequences of my actions. I couldn't erase the possibility of losing my best friend, of losing the one person who had always been there for me. I couldn't do that. I wouldn't. But I couldn't deny the way Dorian made me feel. The way he made everything else fade into the background when he was near. Every time his eyes met mine, I felt like I was falling deeper into something I couldn't escape. Something that wasn't just about physical attraction, but something more, something that felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I needed to make a choice. But every time I thought I knew what I wanted, I was pulled in another direction. I decided to talk to Kian. It was the only thing I could do to clear the air, to stop the suffocating guilt that had taken over my life. The conversation, when it finally came, was nothing like I expected. Kian was quiet, his usual playful demeanor replaced by a somber expression. "Kale," he said, his voice low, "I can tell something's been off with you. You've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to scream, to confess everything, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't do that to him. Not when he was looking at me with those trusting eyes. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile, "just tired." Kian didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press me further. He just nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew, that he could see right through me. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the answers to come to me. The truth, the right thing to do, was still a blur. I couldn't keep living like this, torn between two people, two desires, two worlds that couldn't coexist. The next day, I made up my mind. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with everything weighing on me. I needed to be away from Dorian, away from Kian, at least for a while. I packed my things, my heart heavy with every movement, and decided to return to my own apartment. It was the only way I could think of to clear my head, to escape the pull I felt whenever Dorian's presence lingered around me. The guilt was suffocating, and I knew I needed distance. "I'll do my best," I whispered to myself as I closed the door behind me, to avoid Kian, and most especially Dorian. I need space, time for this feeling to die down. But I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that whatever decision I made now, whether to stay away or confront the storm, would change everything. And once it was done, there would be no turning back.